Welcome to lesson 2.5, solving equations using addition or subtraction. First, we're going to go over a couple of vocabulary words that you will be using throughout this section and while you are solving equations in general. Just as a reminder, an equation is something that has two expressions on either side of an equal sign. For example, 5x equals 20. Okay, so the first vocabulary word we will be dealing with is the addition property of equality. The addition property of equality states that adding the same number to each side of an equation produces an equivalent equation, meaning that if you add something to one side of an equation on one side of the equal sign, you have to do it to the other side of the equation or the other side of the equal sign. All right, the subtraction property of equality, you may have guessed it, pretty much states the exact same thing, except that instead of adding something to both sides, it states that subtracting the same number from each side of an equation produces an equivalent equation. So if you were to subtract 5 from each side, you would have to, or to one side, you would have to do it to the other side. Okay, the next vocabulary word we have is inverse operations. Inverse operations are just the opposites that undo each other. So for example, the inverse operation of addition would be subtraction. The inverse operation of subtraction would be addition. The inverse operation of multiplication is division, and the inverse operation of division is multiplication. Okay, so when I refer to using inverse operations, all I mean is just to do the opposite. So if it's adding, you're going to want to subtract. If you're subtracting, you're going to want to add, and then in another video, we'll talk about multiplication and division. Okay, so when you're solving equations, there are a few steps that you want to make sure you are following. The first is to find the value of the variable that makes the statement true. That's our overall goal of what you're trying to do, okay? To solve an equation, we need to isolate the variable, meaning we need to get the variable or the letter by itself on one side of the equal sign. So if we have a x, on the left side, we want to make sure that like an x plus 5 equals 20. We want to make sure that we get rid of the 5, so we only have the x left. Okay. The next thing we need to remember is we need to isolate the variable. It means to have it by itself, just like I stated. And then to use inverse operations to isolate the variable, which I talked about in the previous slide. Okay, so let's look at some examples. First, we have x minus 3 equals 5. This is the equation that we are going to be solving, okay? Now, what I'm going to do is write out exactly how I would like you to solve the problem. It may seem silly and it may seem like the answer is obvious. However, if you get into the habit of writing out every step, when the equations become longer and more complicated, I promise you it'll be much easier if you just get in the habit of doing this now. I know it seems silly though, okay? So the first thing I want to know is my equation is x minus 3 equals 5. Okay, so I need to, I'm just going to write it out over here again. First, I want to know, my whole goal is to get this x by itself. So I need to get rid of this minus 3 or this negative 3. So I'm going to think about what is the inverse operation of subtracting 3? Well, it would be to add 3. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 3 to both sides. Okay. When you have negative 3 and you add 3, they cancel out, become 0. So all I'm going to have left on this side of the equation is x, and then 5 plus 3 is 8. Okay, and that would be our answer. If we want to check our answer, we're just going to plug 8 back into the original equation. So then I would have 8 minus 3, and that does in fact equal 5. Okay, now I realize that you could probably have figured out in your head that something minus 3 equals 5 has to be 8. However, this is the part where I know it seems kind of ridiculous right now. Just get in the habit. It makes your life way easier. So write it out like this. Okay, so that would be a example of the subtraction property, or the addition property of equality in play here because we are adding a number to both sides. Okay. All right, the next example we're going to have is x minus 4 equals 6. I'm just going to solve it over here so I don't have to rewrite it. So the first thing I need to do is get x by itself by getting rid of this positive 4. The inverse operation of adding 4 would be subtracting 4. Whatever I do to one side of the equation, according to the subtraction property of equality, I have to do to the other side. So I'm going to subtract 4 on this side. Okay? Plus 4 minus 4, they cancel out. I'm left with just an x on this side, and equal 6 minus 4 is 2. If I were to check my answer, I would plug 2 in for x, so I would do 2 plus 4, and 2 plus 4 does in fact equal 6. Okay, so pretty simple concept. The main thing that I want you to focus on is making sure you're doing the inverse operation to isolate the variable, and to make sure you are writing each step clearly as you're solving the problem, even if you think it's ridiculous. Okay? All right. Thank you so much, guys. Tomorrow we're going to have a lesson on how to solve equations using the multiplication or the division.